So hello everyone, welcome to another scrimmage from VPFA, and today these are our debaters, and without further ado, we can start with the scrimmage.
Okay, my speech will start with my first word. We negate the resolution the United Kingdom to rejoin the European Union. Definition: the UK is a constitutional monarchy and parliamentary democracy comprising England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. The EU is a European political organization with 27 member states. Rejoins becoming the official member of the EU under two procedures without opt-out, consensual, one sovereignty. Subpoint A: unilateral veto laws and treaties emphasize qualified majority voting. Furthermore, 16 states, if the UK having left were to seek to rejoin the EU, it would not be in a position to wield a veto. Dust 21 explains each of the 5 revisions of the founding of the Treaty of Rome, Single European Act, Lisbon, etc., has extended the number of decisions that can be taken by the QMV and reduced the scope of the national veto. European Union states the court declares the laws adopted by EU institutions were capable of creating legal rights before the courts of the member states. EU law has direct effect. As the member states transferred certain powers to the EU, they limited their sovereign rights, and thus, in order for the EU norms to become effective, they must take precedence over any provision of national law, including constitutions. Rejoining means the regulatory alignment, hindering and instigating additional administrative and bureaucratic processes in legislations, establishments, and etc. This underpins a substantial provisional compliance costs which inherently hinder economic development, destroying the foundation for long-term development. Subpoint B: existing EU-UK partnership remains mutually and reciprocally beneficial. Rejoining risks weakening ties. Government: UK 25 states. The relationship between the EU and the UK is underpinned by the WA, including Windsor Framework and the TCA. Under the TCA, cyber and counterterrorism dialogues between the UK and the EU have been established. As a permanent member of the UN Security Council and European NATO ally, as well as the G7 and G20 member, the UK is an essential partner. The EU's CSDP and UK's action on and defense make a significant contribution to shared objectives. In the current security environment for the EU, the mutually reinforcing strategic partnership with the NATO is essential for Euro-Atlantic security for the UK and EU member states that are also NATO allies. The Atlantic Alliance remains the foundation of the collective defense. The EU-UK security and defense partnership will reinforce European contribution to NATO. European Commission 24 emphasizes the EU is UK's biggest trading partner. The UK is EU's third biggest trading partner. TCA covers trade in goods, services, investment, public procurement, IPR, competition, state act, aid, tax, transparency, and etc. It provides zero tariffs and quotas on all goods that comply with the appropriate ROO. It allows EU investors to establish the companies in the territory of the UK and operate them freely in most sectors and etc. Rejoining means undermining the immense progress of reversing Brexit effects, undermining continuously deepening ties between the two parties. Rejoining also means undergoing a bureaucratic accession negotiation from scratch, diverting political energy and resources away from domestic priorities. Contingent to economic CBA, cost-benefit analysis outweighs. Subpoint A: rejoining requires the adoption of the euro, which is against UK economic policy. BD 24 emphasizes the euro has a rigid monetary policy that often does not fit local economic conditions. Interest rates cannot be simultaneously raised in the high growth country and lowered in the low growth country like the UK when they have a single currency like the euro. High interest rates increase unemployment and even cause deflation and a negative economic growth. For example, the adoption of euro contributes to an economic depression in Greece. Seagull 23 further highlights the British government would have to abdicate control of its own interest rate policy under the euro system. The UK would have to be forced to meet the euro convergence criteria before adopting the currency, which includes maintaining a debt to gross domestic product (GDP) ratio that would have constrained British fiscal policy. Subpoint B: UK has diverse trade CPTPP, entering non-EU countries, etc. Rejoining restricts UK's engagement in trade negotiations, leads to leeway. Townsend LM 27 elucidates. EU countries cannot operate independent trade policies with third countries, such as concluding bilateral FTAs offering lower tariffs than others. This would undermine the customs union. As an EU member, the UK's FTAs with countries like Australia, New Zealand, India, and membership in blocks like CPTPP would either be superseded by the EU agreements or become obsolete. As the UK's trade terms will be governed by the EU's common external tariff and policy. Evidence 24 has the UK can sign bilateral agreements with the individual EU member states. However, these may be limited in scope and non-binding. EU member states cannot enter into agreements where EU has exclusive competence or in areas covered with the WA or TCA unless specifically authorized. Any such agreement must also take into account the internal market and broader EU interests. In addition to its relations with the EU countries, post-Brexit, the UK has also developed a relationship with non-EU countries, trade with non-EU EEA countries, Norway, Iceland, and Switzerland, were predominantly governed by bilateral agreements with the EU when the UK was still in the EU. Rejoining means UK is obligated to comply with the EU's intervention towards establishment with non-EU members. Impacts of rejoining means job loss, reduced global trade multiplier, economic loss, etc. This emphasizes the immense scope and magnitude and probability of our case. Thus, me and my partner urge a negative ballot. Thank you.
Everyone can hear me, correct? My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. The decision to leave the European Union has already left the UK isolated, economically strained, and environmentally vulnerable. Rejoining the EU is about turning back the clock. It's actually about securing a healthy and safer and more sustainable future. We tell you that the EU already remains the world's leading bloc for environmental protection, scientific cooperation, etc., etc. So when the UK rejoins the EU, it can already restore the lost influence and strengthen its own country. Attention number 1 is on air pollution. Rejoining the EU is like the toxic air is already killing the Britons every day. The doctors already estimate more than 500 premature deaths every week, over 30,000 every year, caused by air pollution, costing the UK 27 billion euros annually, with 99% of the population now breathing air that exceeds WHO safety limits from Georgia 2025. The GP-treated asthma attacks have already surged to 45% year-on-year, and doctors warn this is a public health emergency spanning on all age groups. Yet the government shows no political will to take the decisive steps among necessary to meet the clear stance. Since Brexit, the gap between the UK and the EU environmental protection has widened dramatically. The EU has adopted 28 new or upgraded environmental laws since 2010, while the UK has already delayed or weakened several of its own standards, including the key air, water, and chemical regulations from Hotan 2025. The effect is already measurable. The UK is now falling behind its progress towards the WHO level pollution targets. What this means is the EU law has already a proven track record. Decades of the EU directives already driven consistent declines in pollutant emissions and premature deaths across member states. The new 2024 Ambient Air Quality Directive, binding on all EU members, already tightened for permissible limits to align with the latest WHO guidance, and is projected to cut premature deaths by over 54%, yielding up to 121 billion euros in net benefits. If the UK rejoined, then those standards were applied directly and automatically, which already makes sure uniform enforcement, scientific oversight, and there's already policy continuity. So unlike voluntary domestic targets, the EU regulations come with external accountability. Before Brexit, the European Court of Justice already repeatedly compelled the UK to act on illegal NO2 levels, forcing the compliance when domestic politics fail. So the independent enforcement vanishes after Brexit. This is not just a matter, it's a life and death issue. The fine particulate matter is a group number 1 carcinogen, as deadly as asbestos or tobacco smoke, and now the second leading cause of lung cancer worldwide. In 2021, the UK already recorded 168,873 cancer deaths, a total worsened by long-term air pollution exposure. So rejoining the EU would already instantly restore the participation in the continent's coordinated regulatory work, cross-border data monitoring, and funding for the green transition programs that accelerate the emission cuts. So failure to act already means rising death tolls and escalated NHS costs as the pollutant-linked cardiovascular and respiratory diseases already overwhelm the hospitals on their side. Every ton of emission prevented saved lives and already strengthens the workforce and reduces billions in health and productivity losses. But this is not about clean air. The environmental realignment with the Europe also improves collective security. As the climate and energy crisis intertwine with geopolitical instability, rejoining would already restore the key UK capabilities, which means that there's already cyber intelligence, naval, and diplomatic that the EU already lost at Brexit, enabling Europe to share the defensive burden as the US already shifts the focus towards deterring China. So analysts already warn a Taiwan conflict would cost $10 trillion and upend global energy markets, and a united Europe and UK leadership is better positioned to manage these system risks. And for that, I'd like to message. Thank you.
If there are no objections, I would like to have the first question.
You may proceed.
Thank you very much. So in your case, you've specifically stated that UK and EU agreements and establishments regarding the environmental protection has deepened and strengthened substantially and significantly. Wouldn't you argue that that actually benefits our stance and contradicts yours?
No, I would not argue that it contradicts our side.
Follow-up question, may you substantiate on your point?
Is it okay if you repeat? My side's kind of lagging.
That would be doable. You specifically stated that the UK and EU agreements and establishments has widened and strengthened significantly and substantially. Wouldn't you argue that that actually benefits our stance and contradicts yours?
Is it okay if I have 30 seconds to think of a reply for this, or no?
While you bear that in mind, I would like to have another question.
Yep.
Thank you very much. So, your entire case hinges upon one area, which is climate change, even though the UK's main interest is the economy when it collaborates with the EU. Wouldn't you argue that our side, which argues substantially more about UK's main interests and the economy, would have more satisfactory and on the dot results?
My bad, sorry. Before I like to answer that question, I'd like to answer yours first. So I want to respond this by saying that right now the UK, we tell you that the UK and EU cooperating is not the same as being the part of the system. So we tell you that the post-Brexit cooperation is already voluntary. So which means that rejoining would make those protections more binding. So which means that right now the UK can already choose to diverge from the EU standards, meaning like, for example, environmental or the consumer protections are vulnerable to short-term politics. So is there any questions on this?
I'd appreciate it if you could answer my second question. Thank you very much.
All right, since it's time, I'll start my speech. My speech will begin with my first word. Judge, we would like to first point out that their entire case revolves around what the UK's reaccession to the EU would lead to. However, we argue that simply rejoining itself has an extremely low probability of occurring, owing to the fact that the unanimous agreement of member states is undeniable and concurrently unlikely. Fellow 25 states, as some commentaries have discussed the potential EU reaction if the UK were to seek to rejoin the EU, suggesting that some member states may be reluctant to agree to a UK return to the EU. This removes their impacts, weakening their contention's legitimacy and ultimately their stance. Now I'll be moving on to responding to their specific arguments. Their sole contention was about air pollution or the environment. However, I'd like to rebut to that by saying that without rejoining, the UK and EU can still tackle environmental issues. Burstaro 24 states that the EU-UK Partnership Council, which oversees implementation of the TCA, might therefore provide guidance on what types of energy and environment subsidize, would not normally have negative impacts on trade and investment, for example. This would provide greater predictability as many subsidies to be applied in the EU and the UK will relate to climate transition. The development of more detailed guidance on the implementation of the TCA level playing field provisions on subsidies is not only of significance for bilateral trade, could also provide a useful input into informal WTO discussions on how to improve international disciplines on subsidies. Therefore, we'd like to emphasize that not only is UK and EU able to tackle environmental issues without the need to rejoin, without the need to have for the UK to have full membership, but also this could have a very significant benefit in terms of subsidies as well, also on an international level. They've also briefly touched on how rejoining the EU would be able to allow for improved collective security and defense mechanisms. However, we would like to emphasize that mechanisms for security and defense cooperation already exist and is being expanded on without the need for rejoining. UK, according to the UK government, policy paper 25, as permanent member of the UN Security Council, a European NATO ally, as well as a G7 and G20 member, the UK is an essential partner for the EU. The EU and the UK are closely aligned in their support to Ukraine, notably through the UK Defence Contact Group (UDCG), including the EU Military Assistance Mission EUMAM and UK Operation Interflex. The EU and the UK have decided to establish and implement a comprehensive, balanced, and mutually beneficial security and defense partnership. This emphasizes that there is no need for full membership of the EU into the EU. Now, I would like to, since they have not touched or expanded on any further points aside from environment and security and defense, I would like to reinforce and basically just expand on our case about sovereignty, about unilateral veto loss. We'd like to state that if the UK were to rejoin the EU, then it would have to align with regulations that do not align with the UK's personal interests. This leads to a probable recession and lower employment rates. We've also touched on existing EU-UK partnership, which is mutually and reciprocally beneficial, as we have constantly emphasized also through the rebuttal. And we've also mentioned how the economic cost-benefit analysis outweighs. We strongly emphasize on the economic benefits, which is the main objective and priority of the UK, and therefore we urge a negative ballot. Thank you very much.
Oh, can I have 10 seconds? Thank you. I'll start my speech on my first word. Firstly, then, on sovereignty and lawmaking, all argues that Brexit has restored the UK sovereignty. This is really incorrect because when you actually look at it, to trade with the EU, which is an entirely huge thing to deal with, then which is still the UK's largest partner and the only thing that they can actually rely on, British firms must still follow the EU product and safety regulations anyway. This means that the difference now, which says UK has absolutely no vote or any representation in making those rules. In other words, if we still follow the EU, UK will eventually have to follow the EU anyways, but we no longer help decide policies, meaning that if they actually rejoin the EU, they will have actual influence over the EU laws and not only the independence that opposition claims to have. Moreover, then, on legal sovereignty, that means nothing if the economy and supply chains are completely dependent on the EU, right? The businesses want predictable and actually harmonized regulations, and that can only happen within the EU, which is in a single market. And sovereignty, they haven't really said on that. They're only about how they're going to have a economic growth. But we think that in order to actually have some economic growth, they have to have a single market, a single organized apartment, because EU is still UK's biggest partner. Second, then, on actually trade and economic growth, we think that they're kind of misaligning with their case and they're actually kind of contradicting with their case, because Ox says that if they're allowed to leave, then they will have new trade deals and have actually flexibility. But the evidence that our first speaker gave you can disprove this, right? According to UK Office of National Statistics, when the EU fell sharply after Brexit, when trade with the EU non-EU countries has not increased at all enough to compensate, right? The government's own data shows that Brexit reduced UK GDP by about 4%, and this new trade deals with Australia and New Zealand at only about like 0.1% to their GDP, and that means it's not only negligible to what was lost, it was so much that they had to even have job loss due to the fact that they left Brexit, right? This means that rejoining will actually remove the tariff, we will actually have less delays, and the paperwork that UK now is waiting for firms to billions annually will actually be done. That leads to actually lower prices for consumers to have and higher competitiveness for producers, right? Means that whatever they said on the benefits of the house on having much more jobs, we can actually solve the problem in a much better time, and that leads to lower price. That actually gives them more access to more consumers to the one unified system, right? Thirdly, on control, then all claims that Brexit allowed Britain to control its borders, then, but the data we gave you from second speaker, from first speaker, shows the complete opposite, right? The net immigration reached a record really high after Brexit, with over 6,000 people in 2023. The UK is still dependent on the migrant labor because of shortages in healthcare, agriculture, and hospitality, and they can only have that within the EU, right? Inside the EU, UK could still manage some inflows in some road requirements and some systems, right? But rejoining lets Britain actually have more control over their own country. That means solve more problems in the more control and immigration, since that is actually the UK's largest interest on immigration, which is the entire system why they left Brexit in the first place. For then, and why they can actually reduce much more illegal practices and sharing more intelligence with the EU. That means that with context with which the UK can no longer fully access, they can actually have much more control on context, right? For then, on actual representation, Ops says that if they rejoin, it's going to go down with the democracy, right? That's really not true, because we believe that inside the EU, the UK members of the EUP, directly elected by British citizens, and that's also already a representation, but leaving them actually eliminate their entire voices, right? Also, Brexit already divided the UK, which Scotland and Northern England already voted to remain, yet they were forced to leave because UK leave, right? And that actually damaged their entire unity, because the entire UK now actually includes Northern Ireland. That means that if they actually join, then their entire strength and their entire internal cohesion could be actually much more fair, have more representation, and their policy making would be so much better, and that actually helps our case to win this debate. Proud to propose.
Does Crossfire start now? Right, okay, so if you don't object, I'll have the first question.
No objections.
All right, so do we acknowledge that rejoining is very unlikely? And if so, do you also realize that that would essentially remove your impacts from your entire case as well?
Your main point was on about how you're going to have much more economics, right? But we already gave you the entire prerequisites that UK is completely dependent on the EU. We told you from my first speech that the UK must still follow many EU standards if they want to export to Europe or any other place, right? Leaving means that the Britain has no vote on those rules, and they can still not to actually do anything. So the only choice that they have is actually try to rejoin, which is the entire motion, which is why they have the word should there and not a must. So I'm gonna have my first question here. Then, we're gonna ask you first. If sovereignty is actually your top value, then why did the Parliament vote to keep over 240,000 retained EU laws in May 2023?
Could you expand on that?
In Parliament 2023, Sovereignty Parliament on UK voted to keep over 24,000 EU laws in May 2023, means that UK still actually wants to rejoin EU. Also, the fact that EU actually wants UK to rejoin in order that to expand their market. So how does that actually make your prerequisite much better than ours?
Okay, so first, in response to your point about how UK has kept around 200, roughly 200 of the EU's laws, first of all, that does not inherently mean that the UK wants to rejoin the EU just simply because the UK still replicates a lot of the EU's laws. Second of all, our argument about sovereignty talks about how if the UK were to rejoin the EU, that would lead to veto loss and how it would not have as much political influence. And in response to, and also linking back to my prior question, I asked you about how, if you do acknowledge that rejoining itself is going to be very unlikely. You did not adequately respond to that, so I would urge you to respond to that again. Do you object to that?
I'm gonna answer that question right now. I think that even if it is unlikely, the only choice is that the UK has the only choice of rejoining the EU. Even if it is unlikely, the entire fact that UK kind of needs EU and EU kind of also needs UK, since UK is their biggest chance of having actually global trade details with the other countries, right? That means that even if it is kind of unlikely, even if all 27 member states cannot accept UK, then the fact that they can actually benefit from actually accepting UK means that there is also an incentive to accept UK, right? There are also multiple parliament votes to actually accept UK back again. I believe that your entire point on the prerequisite, it's that it's impossible to rejoin, is kind of untrue according to many statistical details. Another question on my side then. If rejoining required only one simple majority, would you respect that democratic mandate?
Yes, but also, okay, again, back to my point. Just okay, in response to your answer to my question about if rejoining is going to, if you acknowledge that rejoining is unlikely, how I'd like to ask you, even if there are incentives, does that make the process of rejoining any easier? Does that make the process of rejoining any likelier?
We told you already that even if there's no incentive, the entire fact that UK chose to reuse the EU laws, and also the fact that EU did try to parliamentally cooperate with UK in order to give more better market trades with the UK, because they have a lot of partners, right? We gave you already that they will actually have much more of the EU markets, and the data that I gave you in my speech clearly shows that UK wants to export to the EU, and that did even drop after Brexit. Means that that is not really an impact, even if they actually left Brexit, right? It means that if they actually rejoin, it will have much more impact because yeah.
Is time up?
I don't know.
If not, then I'll continue.
Okay.
All right. So we have mentioned we have so just sorry. Okay, wait.
Okay.
I'd like to have 1 minute of prep time. Sorry, my apologies. So my speech will begin with my first word. First, I would like to address the proposition's concerns. The other side argued that UK is completely dependent on the EU and economic growth requires the single market, and Brexit reduced the British GDP. First, the UK being completely dependent on the EU is over-exaggerated. The UK is also a nuclear body, and cooperating with the EU on security matters addresses shared concerns. And I could elaborate that on in the crossfire. Second, economic growth requires single market is untrue. Rebuttal: regulation within the single market discourages the interaction with UK-specific issues and creates disadvantages regarding outer EU trade. Competition policy flaws, bar 23. explains. Europe's competition policy is still fragmented and largely ignores the dynamic effects of competition, especially investment and innovation. Due to mixed legal competition rules are often enforced differently by member states, which states' national authorities, which can be appropriated to support protectionist industrial policy ambitions. Fragmented Services Center Ericsson and Georgia 16 says the partial nature of the single market and significant variation of regulation across countries is best shown in the services sector, where the incompetence of the single market is alarmingly high. 80% of UK's GDP relies on services. The flaws within the single market present a significant drawback, and I could significant drawback. Now onto the clashes. They argued against and now I would like to rebut against their argument to our second argument. They also argue that our second argument by stating that rejoining means gaining more control over a country and means having representation, merely stating a point instead of elaborating and providing cards, especially due to time constraints. However, that is completely contradictory to our first case that we have already elaborated on. However, they just merely stated a few ideas without providing us cards. Now, moving on to the clashes. Number one, the environment. The other side went on and on about the detriments of pollution and the UK's current state of the environment, and barely touched on how the rejoining the EU would actually address these issues in detail, which legislations would be established and enhanced, and how they will enhance legislations and those establishments, not to mention that their entire case hinges upon one sector which isn't even the UK's main interest, which is the economy. When rejoining the EU, their case merely talks about 2 points. The UK is currently failing. Its climate is weakening. Number two, the EU is a savior, and it will do, and the UK will have to oblige to comply with all the EU's regulations. They get which is we clearly rebutted and provided cards to which completely makes a point fall down. Now I would like to move on to the weighing. Our side first has more diversity, which is a very evident part. Second of all, our side has more probability. We talk about and we address the probability of the process, the procedure itself of rejoining the EU, while their side merely talked about the delusional and dreams of what may happen once the UK rejoins. Our side's scope and magnitude outweighs on an astronomical margin, and therefore we urge an affirmative ballot, negative ballot. My apologies. Thank you.
All right, let me skip my timer. My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. At the end of this round, this debate is about whether the UK is stronger alone or stronger together with Europe. The evidence is pretty clear on our side. Outside the EU, Britain is weaker, poorer, and sicker, and rejoining is the only way to reverse the decline. Before on to any further extension, I would like to first rebut a few things. I think that in the crossfire they said that if joining is unlikely, the UK would be the EU's second largest economy and top defense spender. The Brussels has every incentive to strike a pragmatic deal to stabilize trade and security. First of all, onto the extensions then. First of all, we have already told you about the public health and environment. We tell you that the first contention here is about air pollution, and this is life or death. 30,000 Britons die every year from the toxic air, and it already costs the Britons a lot of money, which is 27 billion euros annually. Since Brexit, the UK has already fallen behind. The EU passed 28 new environmental laws, while weakened or deleted key protections. The EU's 2024 air quality objective will already be cut premature deaths by more than half across the country in Europe. So the other side might say that our relationship with the EU is already strong, but cooperation is not enough. A handshake is just a contract on our side. The voluntary coordination cannot replace binding, enforcing the EU law. Before the Brexit, the European Court of Justice already forced the UK governments to meet pollution limits and save the lives. So the external accountability is already gone, and so are the protections. Number two is on the economy, and Brexit is still costing us. Next, the economy. The EU already remains the UK's largest trading partner, yet the UK exports to Europe have dropped significantly since Brexit. The business still must follow the EU standards to export there, but now Britain has no voice in writing those rules. We tell you that meanwhile, the Brexit doesn't control migration, it already shifted it. So the larger shortages already force more of the non-EU immigration, so net migration is already higher than before. The industries from the farming to healthcare are already desperate for workers, and supply chains are already breaking. So the opposition can't have it both ways. We already lost EU trade and lost influence, and still face rising immigration pressures. So which means that rejoining on our side at least fixes the structure for the UK, restoring the access to single market and labor mobility, while at least giving Britain a democratic say in shaping the rules that already affected it. But lastly, then, it's on the democratic. So finally, democracy then. We tell you that Scotland and Northern Ireland already voted to remain, yet we already dragged them out against their will. Brexit already deepened the interval divisions and reduced Britain's voice in Europe. So which means that rejoining the EU already restores their representation in the European Parliament and Council, which means that they are giving the UK democratic influence over decisions that actually influence the trade environment and security. So if opposition says that relations have improved, we tell you that there's already actual evidence from our side because both sides recognize how much they lost. The UK and EU already align on standards and defense, so which means that rejoining simply formalizes the cooperation and gives it more stability. And for that, I'd like to rest my speech. Thank you.
If there are no questions, I would like to have the first question. Objection.
No objection.
No objections.
Thank you very much. So in your summary speech, you clearly stated that rejoining means benefits regarding immigration. However, do you realize that the UK would be obliged to join the Schengen area, which also exposes the UK to transport of illegal products and human trafficking stemming from the lack of immigration control according to SEMA 25? Wouldn't you agree that the UK would be exposed to all these harms? And wouldn't that just turn all your benefits that you've stated?
One thing that we already told you from our second speaker last time, that if you can actually rejoin them, they would actually solve their entire immigration problems, right? We already told you that that we present you with evidence that if they actually rejoin them, their entire illegal system of illegal systems of immigration will actually be reduced because it actually has more stability and actually more efficiency. Because if they actually join, then migration is actually higher because of the labor shortages, right? That means that if they actually join, then the key sectors, e.g., healthcare and agriculture, are actually used. Means that whatever you said on your side of the house about how it's going to be much more work, it's going to be much more illegal and stuff, that actually doesn't happen, right? Moving on, then our question for you is, you said that Brexit is kind of done, right? Yet we're still having tweaks. So how can it both be finished and evolving if you don't agree to rejoin again?
Okay, first, I'm going to address your point first. We never stated that Brexit wasn't harmful. We completely acknowledge and validate how the after effects and the byproducts of Brexit. And we have also clearly stated that there has been evident, notable, significant, and substantial progress between the countries. We've stated how trade establishments between the UK and India, for example, FTAs, which have laid out significant pathway for future FTAs, or with Norway and non-EU countries, we've already emphasized how the UK has expanded its trade partnership beyond the EU. And second of all, I would like to have a follow-up question. Could you send us the cards that send us the evidence and cards that back up your point about immigration? I just sent my email. I'd really appreciate it if you could send me those cards. Thank you very much.
Okay.
And also,
can I ask if this is related to the debate, the email thing?
This is completely reasonable, and it's very common in public forum. I'd really appreciate it if you could send me those cards.
Okay.
And also, I would like to have a follow-up on a very notable clash earlier about the probability of the UK rejoining. So you denied the probability of the UK rejoining the EU, stating that the UK wants to rejoin because the EU is UK's
largest. First of all, we never denied it.
Please let me finish. I'm continuing. Okay. Please let me finish. Thank you very much. You stated how the EU is the UK's large trading partner, and the UK has regulations similar to that to EU, making the UK want to rejoin. However, could you? Oh, sir, time's up. Right. I'd like to use the rest of my time. Okay, let me, right. My speech will begin with my first word. Josh, the debate comes down to whether affirming or negating creates a more sustainable future, particularly for the UK as well as the EU. We emphasize that the entirety of their case has only one link to their impact under the pretense that the UK rejoins the EU. We have continuously proved how the probability of affirming is extremely low, which ultimately removes all their impacts. Even though they have tried to state how the UK wants to rejoin, they disregarded major obstacles and never directly responded to our question. The EU being the UK's largest trading partner and the UK having similar regulations to that the EU
of the EU does not make rejoining any more likely, taking into account compliance costs and unanimous member state approval. Their arguments are not legitimate. Therefore, just do not let them weigh their impacts against ours. It is crystal clear that our probability substantially outweighs theirs. This gives us access to our impacts, which I'll be expanding on later on. They did not effectively respond to our sanction argument, which about opt-outs which removes their immigration argument. We dominated them on evidence and clashes, backing up all our rebuttals, whilst frontlining to all their points with more than adequate evidence, whilst they merely provided a few. They emphasized environmental concerns, whilst we have constantly proven that the UK's interests lie within the economy. By affirming you are allowing for an irreversible impact, death, they are clearly neglecting this impact. That stands far weaker in comparison to our role, which demonstrates regulatory autonomy, sovereignty, economic boosts, and an overall more sustainable future for the UK. Clearly, they have constantly, throughout the entire debate, they've constantly tried to disprove our argument, our point about probability, bring up irrelevant points that do not directly respond to our crossfire questions and to our clashes. They've tried they've tried arguing against our points about rejoining and influence on EU laws. However, we have effectively frontlined and responded to all of them. They have failed to provide enough reasons to how affirming will be able to create a better future for the UK and the EU. Therefore, we urge a negative ballot. Thank you.
Can I start? My speech will start in 3, 2, 1, go. The core clash in this debate is actually whether or not the re-influence and economic access and their sovereignty matters, right? Negative assist that leaving the EU will actually make them have restored control over laws and borders. But we said that UK still follows the EU many laws without a vote and faces many economic damages from new trade frictions, e.g. they have much less leverage internationally, right? If they actually rejoin and they actually try to rejoin, we say here that Brussels has so much more incentive for you to actually join, because if they actually rejoin the EU, then they will be the second largest economy and the top defense partner for the EU. Means that they have absolutely multiple ideas on why UK could rejoin. First impact then, and why our impacts matter more. First, layer 1 on economic costs, right? Within that the OER, multiple independent studies and analyses, have already estimated that Brexit reduced long-run output significantly. In the OER's long-term productivity / GDP projections are a standard baseline up that they cannot just ignore, right? If they replace membership with only a future agreement, then the UK will have less measurable GDP. But we actually have a regain. In the UK's largest export market, which is about 41% of UK exports, so there will be so much more frictionless and job losses because that they have no direct joint that hacks the economic channel. And number 3, their trade volumes and their goods will go down to 2015. Like sectors like food and drink show dramatic export will actually decline much more because they actually don't have real firms, and if they remove tariffs and non-tariff barriers, then that reverses the entire mechanism of harm. Their failures then, why they haven't responded to us, they simply asserted that sovereignty, but they have actually failed to describe how that sovereignty will actually have a much more persistent GDP / export decline, right? And there have been no content rebuttal on how figures was provided, right? They claim that global deals can actually replace the EU, but no, they never gave us any evidence on how to can actually help with the EU market access. We gave you statistics and we gave you sectoral evidence on why they can actually have a smaller magnitude. And they ignore our entire democratic claims on why, even if they actually prize lawmaking, they fail to explain why losing direct and EMP presentation is going to bargain their power, and why the EU rules can still affect the UK. Means that we obviously with the debate, we urge you for a pro ballot.